Good morning and welcome to the first edition of the Gold Goats and Guns interview podcast. My name's Tom Luongo. This is Sunday, September 9th, 2018. I'm here with Alex Krainer, and Alex is the author of The Grand Deception, the Bill Browder Hoax. And Alex was kind enough to grant me in my first interview, so this may be a little rough, folks, so just let's see where this goes. I want to make this an informal talk with Alex, and we'll see how this goes from here. All right, Alex, good to meet you. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for...
Good to meet you, Tom. Greetings to your listeners as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's talk about this guy Browder. I read your book because you were gracious enough to send me a copy of it, and unbidden actually, which was very cool. And so I got a chance to read it, and wanted to make sure I understood it before we actually sit down to have a chat about that. So tell me a little bit about yourself, how this happened to you, why it is that you felt so compelled to put this book together after having apparently read Browder's book and found it wanting, for lack of a better term.
Well, there's several things. First of all, I was vaguely familiar with Browder because I met him in Monaco way back in 2005 in November, and this was literally days before he was expelled from Russia. And I went to see his presentation, which was organized by a local university. And I was very, very mildly interested in the whole thing because I didn't have very much interest in the subject of Russia at all. So I kind of went because I had nothing better to do. And I found the Browder's presentation very fascinating, very interesting. And the one thing that stood out for me is that it was really the first time I ever heard anybody speak in positive terms about Vladimir Putin. And that stood out for me because I was, up until that point, I really didn't suspect that the narrative I was getting through the mainstream media was biased. I just thought, Russia was a horrible place, Vladimir Putin was a terrible man, and as far as I was concerned, that was that.
Right.
And so Browder opened my eyes to the fact that maybe there's bias in the way things from Russia are being presented to us. So the effect of that presentation was simply that I started kind of paying attention to what was going on in Russia, who Vladimir Putin was, and so forth. Anyway, fast forward to 2015, I read Browder's book. And when I read Browder's book, all sorts of bells went off because over the previous 10 years, I followed his story, not closely, but, now I knew who Browder was. So when articles came out about him in Wall Street Journal and New York Times and so forth, I kind of thought like, aha, so let's check this out. So, I was just kind of paying attention. And then, there was the war in Georgia and Abkhazia. There was all kinds of other provocations with Russia, and so as things were heating up a little bit, I was paying attention increasingly, and so I started. My opinion of what was going on in Russia and with Russia diverged from what I was being presented through the mainstream media, and once I read Browder's book, I was very surprised because my understanding of the realities that he was presenting in his book was quite different from what he wrote. And at that time, I didn't think that Browder was a crook, that he was a fraud. I actually had a positive opinion about him, and I believed his story on the face value. I didn't yet come to the point of suspecting anything. So it was only after I read his book that I thought, like, whoa, what's going on? This is not the way I understand the situation. And so I started to research and analyze a little bit. And now the reason why this particular thing turned out to be an important story to me is because, as you may know, in the 1990s, the countries of former Yugoslavia had a series of wars of attrition when Yugoslavia broke apart, and I was involved in that. I was a soldier in the Croatian army, and I remember how the war happened. And the thing that particularly I remember is that probably up until several days before the war started, I think that most people by far, and me included, would never think that the war could happen. Nobody thought the war was possible. It was crazy. It was completely insane. You know, the countries of former Yugoslavia were bonded and linked in all sorts of ways, cultural families where my parents are, you know, my mother is Serbian, my father is Croatian, you know, the newspaper stories about centuries old hatreds is just nonsense. And
Right.
so the thing that struck me is that once the war started, once it was actually a shooting war, everything changed. And from the moment the war starts, the psychology changes. And from that moment on, it becomes very difficult to look at the other side and to be to have empathy towards them, to
Right.
try to understand them, to have balanced views. You know, everything gets polarized. It's us against them, and then you do have hatreds, and then it's all-out war. So, you know, going back to Bill Browder, when I dug under the surface of his story a little bit, I realized that he's very probably part of a clandestine elite, which is trying to polarize the situation between Russia and the West, probably with a view to triggering another major war between Russia and the United States, or Russia and NATO, and so forth.
Right. I
And
think
so after a little,
it's funny.
yeah,
I think
go.
my opinion of Browder was I didn't really have one for quite a long time, and it's in a similar way. I don't have your background, but I think that conclusion is probably close to the truth, and closer to the truth than people want to really admit. Because when you start to put all of what's in your book together with what we've seen from people like the research of Lee Stranahan and Lucy Commissar, and if you know Martin Armstrong and you know his story and how he's related to the situation with Edmund Safra and the money that was stolen from the IMF to set Yeltsin up back in the 1990s, that all of this is one long tapestry of history. And all the same people are at the center of it. And it all revolves around this guy, Browder, who purports to be this hedge fund manager. But to me, he just feels like a CIA asset. You know, he feels like one of those guys, right? That how do you walk into Russia with $25 million in cash to start buying up vouchers for privatization vouchers?
Right.
How do you get that kind of money when you're just a nobody who works at, who's, basically working on consignment and his first job on Wall Street? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't make any sense. It sounds good. It sounds good like an international spy thriller, but when you look at the reality of these things, of how this is done in the real world, you're right. It doesn't make sense. It's a very overstretched story.
Right. So and it's funny for me. I wasn't, even back in 2005, I didn't care about Russia either, right? That wasn't what was going on in my life. As a matter of fact, I was hip deep in my research project that I was working for a small company down in South Florida, and I was much more interested in the gold bull market and all the monetary stuff that was going on. And then, but for me, it's the same kind of story. As you delve deeper into these issues, you can't help but, if you have any nose for the truth at all, or have any desire to understand what's actually happening, you can't help but continue to go down the rabbit hole. And that's where I am today. And the deeper the rabbit hole goes, the worse it all looks. And to the outside world, to the people who aren't who haven't done the research and haven't done the time, all of this looks like just, oh, you guys are out of your minds. This is just crazy conspiracy theory stuff. But it's not, right?
Yeah.
It's really not.
Yeah.
So, let me ask. Go ahead.
Sure. Go ahead.
Oh no! All I was going to ask is, so how much pushback have you gotten directly, either directly or indirectly, either professionally or I know that the book's been, for example, banned on Amazon or was taken down off of Amazon. But have you had to deal with any kind of real, professional or even personal pushback over trying to expose Browder's story?
Well, so far not really. I mean, apart from my book being banned on Amazon, I have not really suffered any consequences. Nothing majorly unpleasant at any rate.
Well,
generally, I can't really tell, but telling the truth about these things isn't especially good for your career. It's not especially good for marketing. I'm a hedge fund manager. I run a commodities trading fund, and I guess marketing a hedge fund isn't really helped by being involved in this kind of a thing. But
sure,
as I tell people in my company, if we end up in a war against Russia, then everything else we're endeavoring to do here won't matter very, very much, And so exactly. I thought, like, if my little effort, if my little role in this world can put another straw on top of the camel's back of this drive to war and helps break it, then I feel very strongly that I have to do my bit,
Right.
And my bit is very small, but if we all say, like, oh, I can't do anything, so I shouldn't risk my own future over it, then we are probably very sure to get involved in another world war. Yeah. And I think the thing that I wanted to tell you before is when you were saying you were doing research in monetary stuff and gold, I think is exactly that kind of research that gives you a dimension of this problem that many people don't get, because there really is a tip of the pyramid, and the monetary system really is the mechanism by which we as people and our political establishments and our corporate establishment are beholden to an elite that is actually choreographing this whole show.
I know.
And so if you research how the monetary system works, then you realize that there's somebody on top, and you realize that there's an agenda, because otherwise a lot of stuff that's going on in politics, in central banking, in economics just absolutely doesn't make sense. But if you understand the agenda, then it does make sense. Suddenly exactly. You realize, like, yeah, they're not so interested in improving the economy for the benefit of all people. They're interested in particular thing and using the economy as a way of getting to those particular things. And so once you get that, then I think you're in a better position to understand that this thing with Browder is not a joke, that this is not just like some random crook who ended up stealing money from Russia, and now he's running around amok, trying to cover his tracks.
Right.
This is a much more serious story.
Yeah, no, it really is. His whole story about Sergei Magnitsky doesn't make any sense, because if anybody would want to see Magnitsky alive today, it would be Vladimir Putin, because Magnitsky is the guy who knew Browder's books better than anyone. And
yeah, exactly.
Because he was his accountant, and so it made no sense. None of it makes any sense on the surface of it. And I know that I'm sure have you seen the Andrei Nekrasov film, the Magnitsky Files? Yeah. And Nekrasov, watching that film and having listened to many interviews with Andrei, it's really obvious that he went through the same process that you did, and he just asking simple questions, and Browder couldn't handle them. So it's very obvious that this is a much deeper story. This goes back to the Harvard boys wanting to destroy Russia in the 1990s. It goes back to it's very much part of the effect, for lack of a better term, the neoconservative political elite in the United States and in Europe that sees Russia as an enormous pool of natural resources to be exploited and taken over. There's also some cultural stuff that's going on there as well. Between various factions, and I don't want to get into the details of that, but it's very obvious that this is part of a plan that has been in place for a long time. It's much the same thing as what's going on now in the end of the Syrian civil war, which is an operation that's been in planning stages within the various sections of the United States government for over 30 years, and now it's been in practice for 6 years, and they're not going to just let it go because they're losing. They're just not. Right? And it's the same thing here with Browder.
Exactly. I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Right. So it was very interesting reading. Because I don't know if you don't know if you know my background or not, but I'm, for lack of a better term, I'm a hardcore libertarian, and I'm a strong Austrian economist. Gold, Goats, and Guns is not just a catchy title; it's an ethos, right? You build your economic system based on your savings. Your personal economic wealth is based on your savings, which is your gold. Your goats represent your industry, and your guns represent how you defend yourself against those who would take the first two things from you. And our current monetary system is not based on that at all. It's based on leveraging future labor, the future value of the labor that you and I filter up through the banking system while they all take a vig. And they'll take a cut of that, and it's an absolutely rapacious and disgusting system that is destined to fail eventually. The question is whether or not the men and women who perpetrated this will ever see justice, and I sincerely doubt it. That's the unfortunate part about this world.
I think, Tom, this is exactly where the drive for war comes from. The system is baked. The system comes with its own future collapse baked in. So the collapse is inevitable, and the farther the leverage goes, the closer we are to the system imploding. And so I think that the attraction of war for these people, the people who are the ultimate beneficiaries of this, is that war gets everything thrown, it's like turning over the chessboard.
Right.
You get a blank slate and you start over, but while preserving the existing structures of power.
Right.
War confuses everything. People can't see the causes of what went wrong in the society. If we go to war against Russia, well, everything's going to be Russians' fault.
Of course,
your pension plan failed. Well, we're at war. Your healthcare is not. You can't get an appointment with your doctor. He's at the front. Everybody has to go to the front lines and fight. Well, that's what happened. And then, when everything is destroyed, and the two sides are forced to sign a peace treaty, which eventually they will do, nobody's going to remember how it started, what happened, and the historians are going to get busy. The court historians are going to get busy whitewashing how it all happened.
Yep. And
so they start the leverage from leverage 0, from leverage 1, and ramp up the system all over again. And that
what's really sad is, to me, that we're in a position right now, and I've written about this extensively recently. I agree with everything you just said, Alex, and that I know that that's part of what they're doing here. Is that when the next financial crisis hits, and we can talk about that a little bit if you want, because I'd love to get your perspective on what it looks like in the commodity trading pits right now. But because I'm a hard currency and hard commodities kind of guy, but but it's very obvious that when this sovereign debt crisis hits and this whole system begins to collapse again, who's positioning themselves to benefit the most from it? What I think the key to understanding why Browder is so important is that the Magnitsky Act itself is a template for the kinds of being able to utilize and weaponize financial systems, even to a greater degree than we did before. So we've always had the IMF and the World Bank, handing out loans and restructuring packages after the currency traders came in and bombed the economy, and then sell them on debt slavery after that. But it's even worse than that now, because everybody who threatens to get off the dollar standard, right, now has to be punished for doing so, and the Magnitsky Act allows them to go after and target people and companies in an extraterritorial manner by weaponizing the banks. And I think that's what Browder's job always was. I guess it morphed after Putin thwarted them in the early 2000s when he jailed Khodorkovsky and nationalized Yukos. So I think, to me, Browder's mission shifted to create this situation that we have now, where the Magnitsky Act is being used as a financial cudgel the world over, and we're seeing it all play itself out daily, practically, in the news right now. What do you think about that?
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I would also add that another dimension of the Magnitsky Act is that it's throwing up barriers to international cooperation in the area of justice, because Russia has been looted in the 90s, and I think that estimates vary between $200 billion and $600 billion that were looted out of Russia. 20 years ago, that was a lot of money. Today we're talking. We're talking. We all got used to talking about trillions today, so I think 200 billion, 600 billion, whatever. People think that Putin's personal wealth is like 400 billion, but 20 years ago that was a lot of money, and that was real wealth. These are not like levered up paper derivatives we're talking about. And so Russian justice system is slowly working to untangle this, to trace the who stole what where, to find the ultimate beneficial owners of this looted wealth, and to start to recover it. And I think that part of the Magnitsky Act is also a tool that can always effectively frustrate these attempts, because they simply place all the individuals who would be key to this process on the sanctions list, and then you're illegitimate. They just slap a label of you on you, like you're some kind of a human rights abuser. And how can you turn up in court and press a case and try to win? You can't.
No, yeah,
and I think that's another use for Magnitsky.
Oh, it's absolutely a great point that you just made. And then when you factor all that in, and then you take into account things like FATCA and the other things,
right.
the other aspects of the U.S. Tax law that has now that's doing everything imaginable to stop the flow of capital around the world. It's trying to drain liquidity and trying to freeze capital in places that it can't run. And these are very important things. And so, as an American, it's very difficult. I can't do business overseas very, very easily. I can't, I'm not even allowed to trade Forex, right? It's not allowed. This is
seriously.
Yeah, seriously. As an American, you can't
trade Forex anymore.
Nope, not for years now.
Oh.
They won't touch it, and it's even worse. And then. Have you looked at what they've done to the cryptocurrency markets, right? If they made it just as bad. We can't open up accounts on, the foreign exchanges anymore. It's crazy how much they're trying to keep the American. They want capital to come into the United States, but they don't want to let it out again. And what's interesting is that they're going to have a real problem with that after, Europe fails and all the money runs over here because it's got nowhere else to go because the American markets are so big. And you can see the setup that they're laying out. If you take a step back and look at it from the 30,000 foot level, you can see how the next couple of years are going to play themselves out. But it's kind of scary, absolutely people have to be prepared for that, but more than strategically and tactically, but emotionally. That there's going to be a fundamental change in the way the United States is looked at, not only internally but externally. The external part of it is already there. There's a lot of people around the world who are very angry with us, and as an American, all I can say is I'm sorry, and there's only so much I can do. I did vote for Trump, but even he's not, good enough, right?
Trump is in the same position as many leaders who challenge the deep state, and
yes.
I've come to understand that deep state is not just a couple of people in the CIA and the Justice Department, the Treasury, and the FBI. The deep state is everywhere. It's absolutely it permeates the justice system, the police, the education system, everything. And this is this is why when you see people like Erdogan, when there was that attempted coup against him, he had to uproot something like 20,000 people from the courts, from the police, from the military, from the universities, because all of that, and you see what's going on. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is constantly under attack, nonstop, and you look where the attacks are coming from. They're coming from everywhere. They're coming from Hollywood. They're coming from universities. They're coming from the courts. They're coming from local government. They're coming from all kinds of non-government organizations. Yes. And unfortunately, the United States, being the democracy that it is, he cannot do what Erdogan can do.
Right.
And if you read history, I realize that this is also what Abraham Lincoln had to do. He threw something like 10,000 people in jail when the Civil War started.
I think where Trump is going to wind up, Alex, to be honest with you, is that he needs to have a real. These midterm elections are going to make or break his presidency. We're going to find out whether or not there's going to be, an overthrow of the United States government by the bureaucracy, effectively saying no. And
right.
Martin Armstrong made the point about this a couple weeks ago, and I'm not, and I've been making the same point even previously, but Martin made it very elegantly the other day, which is to say that the entire world financial system rests on the confidence in the dollar, and confidence in the dollar is predicated on the institutional money's understanding and confidence in the U.S. political system. And if they overthrow Trump extra legally, then the United States will have sunk officially into rule by men and not rule by law.
Yeah,
and that's when everything changes.
Yeah, agreed.
And I don't know that the people who are doing this at this point, whether they understand it or not. I know they understand the potential, but I don't. It's almost like in their arrogance that they believe that, well, we can just get rid of Trump and everything will go back to the way that things were. But looking at the lunacy that I'm seeing here in my home, I'm like, no, this genie's out of the bottle, and you guys have no idea what chaos you've actually unleashed. Because when you said earlier about war is very important, you fought a physical war, which is terrible. We're fighting a culture war here that is ideological. That is going to be, it's even going to be worse when it finally truly lets loose, and that's what I'm scared of.
I tend to feel the same way about that.
So I've been prepping. This is the audience that you've wandered into this afternoon while we sit here and chat, because my people, understand this. This is what I write about every day.
Right.
and this is the thing. So let's get back to a little bit of nitty gritty on Bill Browder, and kind of shift back away from some of the high the kind of high level or high concept stuff, and it's funny, I don't know. Yeah, when I was reading your book, I was incredibly impressed with your ability to take Browder's words and deconstruct them, and then represent them with, I guess the best way to put it is just like a rational eye. And the word rational is actually wrong, and I'm sorry, but it was really impressive to watch because it's something that I like to do as well. So kind of professional props here to watching you deconstruct Browder's text and then explain it back is actually fascinating. It almost made me want to go read Red Notice and then read your book again and kind of go through it and go, oh yeah, Alex, you're killing it here. You know what I mean? So it was really cool. And so I really recommend it to everybody to read it. If you have read Red Notice, that Alex's takedown here of Browder's text is really, really good because it's very insightful, and it just shows, and it just shows a very keen mind. And so really, to me, that was very impressive. And
thank you.
The fact that the fact that you're then willing to publish it, for all the world to see and for all the world to go through, and that stuff, it's hard, right? To do that. I mean, I do it every day as well, but when you're putting yourself out there like that, you could just go along to get along, and
true. I have to admit, as I was writing that book, usually in the evenings every day, I just kind of forced myself. I said to myself, okay, you're going to write something every evening. If it's one paragraph, it's one paragraph. If it's one line, it's one line. But every evening you sit down and you write a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, most of those evenings, I had to have a chat with myself. I had to say, why the hell are you doing this? You could be watching. You could be sleeping. You could be doing any number of things. Why the hell are you keeping up? But it's again going back to the dismal scenario of what if it all goes horribly wrong? How am I going to tell myself that why didn't I do my part?
Right.
So, that way I kind of forced myself to it. And the way I was able to deconstruct Browder is because I read his book twice, cover to cover, because, on a first read, honestly, if I didn't know any better, I would have bought the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. It's that well written. It just guides you by the nose, and it's like a series of 3-card Montes that you just don't get where he's selling you the bill of goods. But on the second read, now that you know the story, and then you read it the second time, you start picking up little details of, where he's being deceitful, where he's lying, where he's stretching through, where he's mixing up the timeline, and so forth.
Oh yeah, and he's very good at that. And it was interesting watching Andrei Nekrasov in his film confront Browder on that very point, and then Browder just saying, immediately accusing him of being a Putin agent and then walking out of the room. I think that would be considered the Act 2 climax of that movie, actually. Thinking as a structuralist, and it was really quite impressive. That all Nekrasov had to do was ask him a very simple question. Can you explain this? This doesn't make any sense. This translation doesn't jibe. He was talking specifically, for those who don't know, who haven't seen the movie, talking specifically about Magnitsky's deposition and what he was asked about. And the English translation of that deposition is what Browder has presented to everyone, and to the European Union, to American senators, and everybody to get this done. And no one ever checked the original Russian. That was, and the differences in those two depositions, and in the translation, is those two texts are manifest. It's like they're two different documents. And when Nekrasov confronted the woman from the EU about it, and her face fell.
Yeah, her face fell, but interestingly, she's holding the same line.
Yeah,
like she's still protecting Browder's narrative, even though she knows it's all.
Well, because she's probably been threatened with her life and career. These people play for keeps.
She's either threatened with her life and career, or she's taking money from, somebody like George Soros, or I don't know who.
Same, effectively the same thing. Yeah, she could just be garden variety corrupt, right? But we've got her on film with her face, with her face falling, and I just want to watch Bombard's body language takedown of her, at that moment, right? That would just be like, oh no, she just died, she just died inside. Yeah. She knows she's trapped,
Yeah.
I just watch that woman do the little dance behind her keyboard, and then say, "Oh, right. Yep, she's done." Right? She's wonderful, that woman. She's fantastic. So it's a fascinating thing to watch this all play out, but if we didn't have to live through it, and the stakes weren't so high, it would almost be comical to watch this play out. And unfortunately, it's not, because it's the problem with comedy is that it's tragedy plus time. And unfortunately, we're living through the tragedy, so we can't laugh about it yet because there hasn't been enough time passed hopefully everybody, cooler heads prevail, or at the very least that the people who understand this, and I do believe that Putin and many around him, and many of the people that he's working with, understand this fundamentally and have a plan to mitigate the worst of this as much as possible.
I'm convinced that Putin and his entourage, his advisors, that they understand exactly what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why they have been extremely good at resisting provocations and not taking the bait,
right?
Because they know what the game plan is,
right?
Which is another reason why these elites want a regime change in Russia, because if they had somebody in power who would take the bait, who would give them the war, then they would get the war as well.
Right.
That would be awesome for them. It wouldn't be very good for any of the rest of us. But
no, it really wouldn't. But the one thing that gives me pause about the doomsday scenario, and I was writing about this, and I've got an article going into Strategic Culture Foundation. I sent it in over the weekend. Should be coming out either Monday or Tuesday. So right after we were finished talking, I said we're at that moment where they've pushed the moment to its crisis point, and now they're asking us the Faustian bargain of, look, we want this, and we're willing to risk World War III to get it. So are you willing to submit yet? And Putin's answer has been no. And Mattis, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and Minister of Defense, Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, both understand the stakes. And if push comes to shove, I don't think either of those men will let John Bolton or Bibi Netanyahu or anybody else start World War III, because they both know that once the shooting starts, they're in it, and it'll be bad for everyone. But I also understand that those two men are hard bitten and will defend their country like dogs, and like rabid dogs, and I expect them to do so. And because of that, I expect cooler heads to prevail, because they will put a stop to all of it. And the guy who stands at the center of this is Donald Trump. And and if you notice last week where they started the open talk of sedition against Trump, that the first thing that they wanted to undermine was Trump's relationship with both his chief of staff, General John Kelly, and Mattis, by leaking salacious quotes about them, him being an idiot and all this stuff. And I don't buy any of that for a second. That's a pure psyop. Whereas the guy who you don't see in the media right now is John Bolton. He's been completely sidelined after he tried to scuttle North Korea.
Yeah.
So, Yeah, Trump came out, I think today, this is the 9th, I think Trump came out this morning and praised Kim Jong-un again and said, we're going to have peace. Don't listen to these guys, effectively. And that just tells me that Trump understands what the stakes are. He understands the situation, and he's doing his very level best. And I think that he's doing what Putin's doing, which is running a war of attrition against these guys and just letting them hang themselves with their own noose, with their own rope.
Yeah, that is my impression as well. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, I had a moment of doubt, which was when Trump launched the rocket attack.
You and me both, man. You and me both.
In Syria. But then,
yes.
Yeah, okay. But then I realized after the dust settled that was actually a masterstroke by Donald Trump, because he got everybody to rally around him, because everybody gets hard about using the weapons, the beauty of our weapons and all that. And so he kind of calmed down all the criticism. And he actually launched 56 missiles into an empty lot. Didn't kill anybody. He informed the Russians in advance. The Russians obviously must have informed the Syrians. So it was a move for domestic consumption of these dogs of war and the military-industrial complex, and everybody who wants desperately to involve the United States in another war. Mm-hmm. So he gave them bait, but didn't actually exacerbate the situation on the ground in any real way. And then I realized that Trump seemingly understands what he's doing. He seems to have a good, solid relationship with real people, not the neocons, but the real Pentagon, mm-hmm. American patriotic generals who understand what their country is, who are not globalists, who are not empire builders.
Yes. And
who are advising him against the advice he gets from the neocon faction. And so I'm very hopeful that this is going to hold. But as you noted, there's very strong psyops going on to try to destroy this, and I think that the danger is far from gone. I think.
I absolutely agree with all that. I will say though, that my take on Trump is a little bit more nuanced than that, and I do believe that Trump is impulsive and prone to all the kinds of fits of impulse that he's been accused of, and he also gets a lot of bad information from his staff. And I'm not unhip to his character defects, and so I'm willing to say that I think he may have actually intended to do more damage with the airstrikes in April of this year, not necessarily last year's, but there's ones in April of this year. I think he may have actually intended those to do more damage than they did, and that Russian electronic warfare, their missile defense systems, and a little bit of James Mattis ensured that was not was no more devastating than it could have been.
Right. Yeah.
I don't doubt that, and so I refuse to give him that much credit on that. I just think that because I can't. I don't have enough evidence for me to get to do that at this point. But I'd like to. I'd love to believe that version of it, and I would love to believe that version of it. But I'd rather believe somewhere in between the kind of middle position between Trump's a lunatic and Trump's got a plan, man. And I think it's somewhere in the middle. And
yeah, I think it's very difficult to say. It's impossible. Right. I think maybe it's impossible to know.
Oh, it is.
I just because so my thing with Trump is I know of Trump, from the media, and then at some point I read his book. I thought his book was rubbish completely, and it kind of reads like a guy detailing his favorite trades, and right. omitting the crappy ones. So like. He's right. Obviously an egomaniac. There's no doubt about that.
Of course.
And then, I've always had a very negative impression of Trump, his style, his character, and all this. But observing things he's doing, observing the way he's being treated in the media, and the results that he's actually achieving, is telling me that maybe there's a method to his madness, and then maybe he and the people he surrounded himself with understand the stakes, and they understand what the game plan is. And from like from some people who are like secondhand close to the administration that I've met over the years,
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that Trump is actually on a regular basis talking to Xi Jinping in China,
Yes.
and with Vladimir Putin,
Yes.
and that between their three cabinets, there's a resolve to end the wars.
Yes.
And take the wars on a path to peace and cooperation. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but that's what I've been told. And observing what's going on, maybe that is true, and I hope it is.
Yeah, I've been operating under the assumption that Trump wants a grand bargain for peace in the Middle East for over a year now, since he first visited Saudi Arabia back in April of 2017 or March of 2017. It's going to be a very long and winding road, and I think he's made some very smart moves and he's made some pretty dumb moves. But I also know that Donald Trump's instincts are excellent, and so he'll never admit when he makes a mistake. He's too much of a narcissist for that. He'll just move on to the next thing. He's like a hockey goalie. He's got no memory of what he did yesterday. He just moves on to the next thing. He doesn't dwell in the past, and because of that. That makes him actually the right man for the job, because he tries things, they don't work. He changes his tactics and then moves on to the next thing. And I also believe fundamentally that he trusts that Putin will not allow things to escalate, because Putin is the master at parallel escalation and turning every provocation into an escalate where he gets his pound of flesh, but he doesn't escalate. And it actually, by doing that, actually exposes his enemies even more so. He's a master at this. And because of that, I think that Putin's playing for time. I read a great article recently that reminded everybody of Peter the Great, Peter Stolpian's phrase about Russia, saying that all Russia needs is 20 years of peace and quiet from the West. If they would give us that, we can rebuild anything, and we could begin our glory. We can begin a glorious period of Russian history. And Putin is playing for his 20 years, and he's about 15 years into it right now.
He's actually 18 years into it.
Well, yeah, he's 18 years in power, but I think the first couple of years don't really count. I think it was a failed state at that point. I think think from the moment he kind of like nationalized Yukos and jailed Khodorkovsky, I think that's when he began to really turn the country around. But he's been playing for peace the entire time, knowing that allows the Russian economy to remake itself. And the Russian society to remake itself after the horrors of the 90s and the end of communism.
Right. Yeah.
So, Alex, this has been a great talk. I'm really glad you called me this afternoon. I was despairing we would ever get a chance to do this because, for everybody who doesn't know this, but the minute Alex sent me the copy of his book, which was well over a month ago, we've been trying to get this done, and our schedules have just not been able to mesh. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me this afternoon.
It was my pleasure, Tom.
And I hope maybe we can do this again when schedules permit. I think it would be very cool. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right. So, Alex, if you want to tell everybody where they can find your work, or what you do, and more or more appropriately tell us about your business and whatnot. I'd love to hear it.
Well, I think that my business is not worth mentioning much because, I trade commodities for a living, and, God, what could I tell you about that? It's just
I think that'd be the next episode that we do this. That'd be fun. I'd really love to get your opinion on it. That'd be great.
Yeah, because, Either I can make it a zero story, or we could spend another 6 hours talking about that.
I'm good either way, man. There's an editing thing. There's an editing function in Audacity, so we're good.
Aha, okay. Yeah, but it's almost midnight over where I am. So anyway, my book is no longer available on Amazon, unfortunately, where it's most easy to buy. But Red Pill Press, the only publisher brave enough to publish the book, has a website where the book is available in paperback. So that's Red Pill Press, and we also have a website where the Kindle version and the Nook version and the PDF is available in electronic format, and that's called the thirdalliance.ch. One day we can talk about the Third Alliance and what the name entails and what that means, because it's rather important actually. For the time being, it's just a website where the book is available in electronic format. And I think that's pretty much it for this edition. But it's been a privilege and a pleasure for me to talk to you, Tom. My greetings again to all your listeners. I think we're dealing with very important topics, and we're trying to, I guess we're trying to keep the world a good place for our children and their children. And
absolutely,
I think being passive about it isn't going to cut it. We've already done that twice in the previous century, and the consequences are so unthinkable that I think that we all have to do our part to understand what's going on, to pay attention, and to do what we can to leave the world in the state that will make our children's life as good, better than now. Yeah, exactly. So it was my pleasure, Tom, and that's that for me.
Thank you, Alex, and I appreciate it, and very, very well said, sir. So have a great night, get a good night's sleep, and we'll talk again soon.
Bye, Tom. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.